Hey students, this is Professor Gore, and in this lecture for Module 3, we're going to be kind of breaking it up in a couple parts. And this is titled The Economic Transformation. And so it really consists of four distinct kind of revolutions that we'll talk about. The Industrial Revolution, the Market Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, and the Communications Revolution. So I'm going to explain each of these four things and kind of show how they're connected to each other throughout these couple part lectures. So one thing you got to understand that allows the Industrial Revolution really to take part is what happens over in Great Britain in the 1700s, but also what's happening in the United States. So the Industrial Revolution, the first phase of it, okay, there's really two phases, the way historians and economists look at it. The first phase begins in the 1700s in Great Britain with the invention of the steam engine. Okay, and so what allowed Britain to be successful, and the reason why the Industrial Revolution happened there is they had innovations like the steam engine. They had navigable rivers and coastline. They had access to coal and iron that was relatively closer to the Earth's surface on the British Isles. They had population growth that allowed people to be able to work for lower wages. And they also had money, the capital necessary to be able to fund these factories. And the reason why they had that is what happened in the colonial time period in the age of exploration in the British Empire. So Britain kind of kept the steam engine a secret for a long time. And in fact, they made it a crime if you tried to draw anything or any kind of schematics of the steam engine. But a British immigrant came to the United States in the 1790s and settled in Rhode Island, and his name is Samuel Slater. And Samuel Slater had worked on the steam engine, and he memorized its dimensions, which is incredibly difficult, all the parts of it. And when he immigrated to the United States, he built it from memory, and thereby created the first factory in U.S. history in the 1790s. So, in order for one of the characteristics that you have to have in the Industrial Revolution is you have to have a population who can initially work for low wages, because industry to start out is very expensive and also expensive to maintain. And so labor is going to be any kind of factory owner's biggest cost, typically, not always, but typically. And, whether it be a steel mill later in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution or oil refinery or something like that. But in the first phase, you needed kind of a population who was willing to work for cheap wages. Now, Britain had a greater population, and so they were willing to work for lower wages than even Americans were, at least in the first phase of industrial. That's going to change in the second phase, which eventually allows the United States, one of many factors that allows the United States to catch up with the Great Britain. So, but one of the things you have with population growth, we've covered this in different lectures, but immigration, and we're going to cover the German Irish in part 2 of this lecture. But they're coming over in large numbers, but also immigrants from Northern Europe, like Scandinavia, England, Scotland, Wales, and England altogether. Other parts of Northern and Western Europe, Germany, Ireland, and so forth. And also the population is doubled every 25 years because American families are having lots of kids. So we have really high birth rates. And, the health is not what it's going to be in the 20th century, certainly, but death rates weren't as bad. Why? Because Americans were better fed because of availability of land to farm and so forth. Okay, so you can see from this graph right here, it shows the population from 1620 to 1860. So you can see in 1620, early on you have less than maybe 1,000 migrants in the U.S., if that, to it rising and particularly taking off in 1800 at 5.3 million to 1830 at 12.9 million to in 1860, 31.5 million. And so one of the things you begin seeing is pouring into the Western states. And that's because of availability of cheap land. And federal government is going to sell it to land speculators who are going to subdivide it and then sell it to other people. So that's why you see this pouring in after the American Revolution between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, pouring into the Midwest, Kentucky and Tennessee first. And then Ohio second, and then you have like the old American Southeast, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth. So population is doubling every 25 years. That's great. Immigration is pouring in. It's what's crazy. As much as it pours in the first half of the 1800s, it's still not going to touch what it is going to do in the second half of the 1800s and the early 1900s till about 1920. It's crazy how many come. So two great changes. You have growth and mechanization of industry, which is Industrial Revolution, and then expansion, integration of markets. All right, so let me talk about two of the four revolutions that we're going to cover in this topic. So the Industrial Revolution is the creation of industry. Okay, so factories that are powered by steam in the first phase Industrial Revolution, later by electricity as the second phase Industrial Revolution progresses. And so they're making clothing initially. That was the first thing made. Also mining coal and iron ore. Those are the three first things Industrial Revolution. And then it's eventually going to be, using steam power to make farm equipment, to making tools, to making firearms, various items. Okay. Now the market revolution is the expansion of markets. That means the expansion of where you're selling goods, because as Americans are expanding west, naturally the markets are going to expand west with it. But also the availability of goods. Americans are going to have access to more goods than really they ever have up to this point in American history. Now it's going to continue to go all the way to 2000, the 2000s, 2018, 19, and so forth, where we have a more availability of consumer goods than we've ever had. But that's just going to increase. That would not be possible without the Industrial Revolution. Okay. And because the market revolution happened with the Industrial Revolution, also the market revolution happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution, it's going to lead to greater demand for products, which thereby increases the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution caused the market revolution, but also the market revolution supports the Industrial Revolution growing and continuing. So they work together to have economic growth in American history. It's pretty cool. Let's look at the American factory system. The father of the American factory system, a guy named Samuel Slater. He, as I told you at the beginning of the lecture, he immigrated to the United States in the 1790s, built his own steam engine, and created the first textile mill in 1793 in Rhode Island. And pretty impressive guy in American history. Now, what were some American advantages compared to British industrial advantages? So one is that the United States had even more coal and iron once we discover it than even Britain does. You know why? Because we're a larger nation, but also where the United States sits, we are blessed with natural resources. That has always been an advantage for the United States. We've been blessed with oil. We've been blessed with iron ore, coal, copper, gold, and silver deposits, and so forth. Availability of massive amounts of timber. We also have quite a few rivers, particularly navigable rivers. So that means rivers that you can actually put a boat on and navigate safely. So waterways for travel. We have the Great Lakes. That is tremendously important. And we have a lot of coastline. And we have some coastal cities like New York, like New Orleans, that are navigable for ships. Also, the United States passed with the American system under Henry Clay. The United States is going to pass tariffs to protect American industry. So even though British goods would have been less because their wages were so low, because they had a greater population who was desperate for work, the United States tariffs makes their goods more expensive, so thereby encourages Americans to buy other American products. Now, the British advantages, they had the cheapest shipping. Okay, so they had the cheapest UPS, FedEx, and DHL at this time. Also, British banking had lower interest rates, so that helps you and your profitability for industrial factories. And then also, they were able to sell their clothes much cheaper because of their cheaper labor and because of cheap Southern cotton coming from plantation. Now, don't get me wrong, the American textile mills had cheap Southern cotton as well, but their workers got paid more. Okay, so there's 12.6 million people in Britain compared to 7.3 million in the United States when the first phase industrial revolution started in the United States. So one of the things that you'll see as well is originally manufacturing was done under different roofs. You would have, let's say you're taking a shoe, for instance. You might have the sole manufactured under one roof, and then you might have the outsole manufactured under a different roof. And then you have the laces, and then you have the insoles under a different roof. And so one of the things you see Industrial Revolution expands and improves, from the early 1800s throughout to the Civil War, is that they're going to increasingly put manufacturing all under one roof. Now, when you think of a factory, you think of everything produced under one roof. Like my John Deere riding lawnmower was manufactured in Tennessee, all under one roof. Okay, so one of the things too that the United States is going to be very innovative. A lot, really, some of the best inventions early on were all coming from Britain, without question. The United States is going to get more innovative as we get close to Civil War, particularly after Civil War. The United States is extremely innovative. Now, Americans may not be able to make something originally, but oftentimes they could observe the British version of it, figure out how it works, and then improve upon it. And so one of the things that Paul Moody did, he didn't invent the first spinning loom by any means, but what he did is he figured out a way to improve the spinning loom to give us even faster production, thereby lowering the cost of the clothing, which is impressive. One of the things that does happen as a result of the Industrial Revolution, okay, this is huge for my world history classes, is it leads to the rise of middle class. So the standard of living did rise. Now, for the average wage worker who was unskilled, yeah, their pay was crap, their living conditions are crap, and their working conditions are crap. But because of the Industrial Revolution, it leads to a growth of what we call middle management positions, so people who are managing other employees. And so if you're managing other people, naturally there's going to be a higher salary that comes with that. And so who knows, your parents may have management jobs in their particular careers. And so they get, typically the more people you are over, the higher pay, because you have a greater responsibility. Therefore, greater responsibility equals greater pay, typically, not always. So standard of living did rise. Also, the factory owners, as 1800s progress, are going to create some of the greatest wealth, not only in American history, but world history. In fact, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie arguably made more money than any other people in world history. The only guy in world history that supposedly could compete with them was Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire in West Africa. The gold guy, as my students always called him. I mean, he was the baller of ballers in world history. But other than him, you can't really compete with John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. And it's difficult to compare what his wealth was with the amount of gold in West Africa, but probably he was probably wealthier for that day and age. Now, workers oftentimes, instead of doing different tasks in the industrial process, as time goes along, they began doing the same task over and over and over, and it's extremely monotonous. And it led to a lot of industrial workers end up drinking rather heavily, particularly Irish and even Germans. And so that's going to help contribute to the temperance movement, because people were showing up drunk on the job and causing further workplace accidents when their jobs were already dangerous. And so when you're doing the same job over and over and over, it really erodes a worker's control of their labor. And so that's where you're going to start seeing labor unions emerge, where workers are going to start bargaining collectively, so bargaining together to try to accomplish their goals. Okay. Now, but as the United States is increasing industrial revolution, just like the British, they're going to get better, they're going to get faster, and they're going to be able to produce more goods in less time, therefore lowering the cost. And when you lower the cost to produce something, you can always lower the prices. So it's basic economics. That's one reason why you see so many companies manufacturing stuff overseas, because you got lower labor, less regulation, and so they can produce the good for cheaper, give you the same quality, offer a lower price, therefore increase their sales and increase their profitability. So let's talk about some new technology that emerges. Overhead pulleys. This is something we don't think much of, but how can you even lift an engine out of a car to work on it? You're not strong enough to lift that out of the car by yourself. But if you strap it to rope that is able to distribute the weight through a pulley system, boom, then you can raise and lower an engine out of a car a lot easier. Okay. Flour mills driven by water power. If you ever get a chance to go to Smoky Mountain National Park, you can actually see a real mill grinding grain, and it's used water power to do this. And China had invented this centuries before, but still pretty cool that it was widely used in the U.S. Steam engines, okay. Steam engines help power the first phase of the Industrial Revolution and some of the second phase until electricity eventually replaces it. So what area of industry blossomed first? That's simple. It's going to be textiles. That's making clothing, Okay. In the colonial time period, you really distinguish somebody by the type of clothes they wore. Okay. What their economic class was. If they were wealthier, they had nicer clothes. If they were middle class, which was smaller, then they had a little bit lesser clothes than that. And if they were poor, then their clothes showed that. But one of the things the Industrial Revolution does, it makes clothing far more affordable. And so, like, you might see a poor person wearing a suit and a wealthy person wearing a suit. Now, granted, the wealthier person probably can afford a nicer suit, but usually what would happen is tailors would buy fabric. You would come in, get measured for a suit or a dress if you were a lady and so forth. And then the tailor would take your measurements and then take the fabric that you picked out and then cut and sew together the suit or dress that you were wanting to purchase. Now you got to pay a lot extra for tailored clothing. This is what an early textile loom looked like. Now, one of the things that American factory owners started in the 1820s really is trying to beat the British at their own textile mill game. And so what Americans did in Massachusetts, Francis Lowell particularly is why it's called Lowell Mills, is he kind of created a town based on a British model where the whole town was centered around the factory. That if people either all the townspeople's jobs are tied to the factory, or like if they were a store owner, were tied to the wages made off of working in the factory, and then they bought goods at their stores. So one of the things that Francis Lowell did is he hired young single women. Okay, so typically women did not work once they were married. So what Francis Lowell did is he hired young single women to work in his factories, and then once they got married, they would quit working there. And he was able to pay them lower wages. And so you see what, a hot button issue politically is the wage gap. But one of the things that you'll see is that really is a few groups that get paid less in the 1800s, throughout the 1800s in factories. First group is women, because in theory, the factory owners thought at that time that a man could do more work in a given day than a woman, so therefore they should be paid less. Anyway. Children were paid less, and one of the reasons why children were sought after, particularly in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, is their small bodies and hands could fit into machinery much easier, and they could work them like a dog, and then they could pay them really crappy wages. You also had free blacks living in the North, and then recent immigrants. All four of those groups get usually wage discrimination. And particularly if you were in those four groups and you were an unskilled laborer. Now, if you were skilled labor, you got paid better because not anybody can just pick up your job and do it. So this is what Lowell, Massachusetts looked like in 1832. You can see it was right there on a river. A factory had to have water access for the steam engine. Okay, you can see where the railroad would typically be brought in to ship the clothing out. And you had all these different factories and so forth that were there. And you had various factories and whatnot. Also, the boarding houses were within walking distance to the factory. And they usually had Sundays off because they were supposed to attend church. Okay, so by 1850, only 10% of women working for pay outside the home. And those of that 10%, well over 50% were single. And so some women would work to support sending the older brother to college. Now, my sister and I have a great relationship, but I seriously doubt she would have worked so that I could attend college when she was stuck at home and not doing that. But this idea of this cult of domesticity, one of the things that you see change in American society is that because of the factory system, for the first time, not only in American history, but a lot of times in world history, that the men went away from the home to work. Normally, if they were a farmer, the husband and wife worked together in the fields. There'd be times when the wife would be cooking and cleaning inside the home, but they basically were there on the farm together. With the Industrial Revolution, it takes them out of the home. And so you have people in society was, hey, well, women's place is in the home, and it glorifies women as traditional homemakers. Now, the women's rights movement doesn't necessarily challenge that. They just want political and legal rights before the law. Now, you'll see that change when we get to the feminist movement later in the second half of U.S. history. Okay, so also some married women worked. And because if you were a married woman working, that could eliminate the amount of time that you could actually work, or you could actually have children, because back then there was no formula, okay, to mix with water to create, milk for children. So if you had a child, you would typically nurse them for a minimum of a year, if not more. Okay. Well, if you're nursing a child, breastfeeding, there's no way that you can work in a factory and expect you or your child not to get ill or sick, and so forth. So it limited the amount of time that you could do that. And so married women that worked in factories just had less kids. So therefore it shrunk the size of the American family. Now, the vast majority of American families was not like that, and they had lots and lots of kids. And of course, a lot of them also died from various, illnesses when they were newborns and babies and so forth. So, so one of the things that you'll see, that it changes the American family is, one, the husband leaving the home to work. Secondly, women who worked outside the home also, it changed the American family dynamic as well. Now let's talk about the Sellers family. Okay, and the Sellers family is kind of an interesting thing. They were a group of family inventors from Philadelphia, and the most famous one was Samuel Seller, and he invented a machine for twisting worsted woolen yarn to give an occasionally smooth surface, so basically nicer clothes. His son John used water power more efficiently to power the family sawmills. His sons and grandsons invented machine shops that built leather fire hoses, paper making equipment, and eventually locomotives. They and other mechanics, chemistry, mathematics, they and others founded the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia that provide high school level instruction in mechanics, chemistry, mathematics, and mechanical drawing. Craftsman, Ohio did similar. Around 1820, the U.S. Patent Office was issuing about 200 patents for new inventions each year, mostly to gentlemen and merchants. By 1860, the office was awarded 4,000 patents annually, mostly to mechanics from modest backgrounds. So with innovations, you could make a name for yourself and kind of achieve the American dream and self-made man. One famous American inventor is Eli Whitney. Invented the cotton gin the same year that Samuel Slater brought the first steam engine to the United States. Now, that may be a coincidence, but the textile industry takes off around the same time that affordability of cotton cultivation and becoming very wealthy. So it's a simple invention. You have these metal prongs. I normally, when I teach in class, I show students a cotton plant, so they can feel the seed inside the fibers. But you drop the cotton that you've picked in the field. As you spin this handle, you have kind of like a comb underneath the metal prongs that grab the cotton fibers and it pulls it. And so the seed gets caught by the prongs, and then you just remove the cotton from the comb, and you've got, cotton that's been unseeded. And what else did Eli Whitney invent? He invented, because actually making them out as cotton gin, he sold it without a patent, but interchangeable parts. And this revolutionized manufacturing and machinery. He took like 10 rifles, took them completely apart, mixed all the parts up in front of Congress, and then reassembled each 10. And they were like, whoa, interchangeable parts is awesome. So results of the cotton gin, it led to the growth of the American textile industries. Okay. Don't have that without cheap cotton. Secondly, led to the expansion of slavery. Is that going to be an issue? Yes, it will be, especially in Module 4 when the American Civil War is fought. One of the things that you see as well is that more and more Americans were being entrepreneurial. And so entrepreneurial means that you're like starting your business and you're hiring workers and expanding and so forth. So mechanics in the textile industry invented lathes, planners, and boring machines that turned out standardized parts for new spinning jennies and weaving glues. So even if you're not in the textile industry, you could be making parts for the machines that help make those clothing. So by the early 19th century, many American craft workers had developed an artisan republic ethic. And what that means is it's a collective identity based on the principles of liberty and equality. So they basically agree that, hey, we should have freedom to make this stuff, and we also want to make quality products, and everybody's got an opportunity to do this. They saw themselves as small-scale producers, equal to one another and free to work for themselves. However, as the outwork and factory system spread, more and more workers took jobs as wage earners. They labored under the control and direction of their employers. Unlike women, who embraced factory work because it freed them from parental control and domestic service, men often bridled at their status as wage workers. Instead of having masters and servants, they used the Dutch word boss for their employers and hired hands to describe themselves. The artisan Republican ideal, a byproduct of the American Revolution, was giving way to the harsher reality of the wage workforce in industrialized capitalistic society. Okay. This is what a cotton gin looks like today. It's pretty cool. Another inventor that's really cool is a guy named Robert Fulton. Now, you also had a guy named so Robert Fulton, and then you had John Finch that actually invented the first steam engine. The problem is Finch is actually sunk, and so if you're going to make something that's really awesome and innovative, it's got to work. So Robert Fulton invented the first steamboat. It's called the Clermont, and it was able to travel down the Hudson River. And it was very, very slow, but it was still revolutionary for that time. And eventually you're going to have steam, more and more steamboats, and then eventually ocean steam engines. And like, the Titanic was a massive steam engine that sunk in 1912. John Deere, who I grew up push mowing with a John Deere push mower on over an acre growing up. But John Deere really started his company by inventing the steel plow. Before, steel was made out of iron. Well, steel is iron ore that you've removed the carbon impurities to make it stronger and lighter. Iron also rusts, and iron is heavy, and it was effective to plow up land. But if you've got a lighter steel plow that's just as durable and tough, pulled by a horse or donkeys or mules or oxen of some sort, then you can plow up land that would be much more difficult to plow up otherwise. So it revolutionized farming. Okay, now the communications revolution consists of a couple different things. One is the telegraph, but before the telegraph, you had faster mail service, and you have like the Pony Express, that speedy service, but it had a short existence because of the telegraph kind of makes it obsolete. You had faster ocean transportation, so that increases communication speed. But really, the telegraph is revolutionary for communication. And so you can send magnetic signals via code, hence Morse code. And you could send a message, just send each letter via code, and then you have a transcriber who is getting those messages and then handwriting out the code, and you can get a message. So how they made money is you paid like Western Union Telegram to send something. And later in the 1880s, it's eventually going to be surpassed by telephones. Cyrus Field laid the first transatlantic cable in 1858, and this was for telegraph. So now you can communicate from the U.S. all the way to England. Elias Howe and Isaac Singer. There's actually several inventors of a sewing machine, but these two guys' inventions were the most famous. And so they allowed the mass production of clothing. And because they had more sewing machines, you could have multiple workers working on products across the factory. And it was crazy. Cyrus McCormick's The Mechanical Reaper. Very impressive thing. And what it does is, when you cultivated grain, you can only plant so much because you couldn't harvest it all at harvest time with your sickle. It's like a long wooden shaft with a metal sword basically on the end. And so, but Cyrus McCormick's Mechanical Reaper, you pull it behind horses or donkeys or mules or something, and you can cut land because it spins this blade, cut the grain, and then you bundle it, and you can cultivate a lot more grain than you could otherwise. Now let's talk about wage workers. Okay, as Industrial Revolution gathered momentum, it changed the nature of work and workers' lives. And it made a lot of in some ways, it improved the standard of living for a lot of Americans of all the industry, particularly the factory owner, the middle class, even the wage earner working class. It did improve their standard of living to a certain extent, but they did the same monotonous jobs over and over and over. So there's three things that labor unions are almost always going to be pushing for in American history. One, better pay. I mean, who doesn't want better pay? Secondly, better hours, so less hours. So if they increase their pay, but working less hours, they can still bring home the same money and spend more time at home and less time working their rear off. And then thirdly, better working conditions. So, which is interesting. And basically, these workers saw themselves as small-scale producers, equal to one another and free to work for themselves. However, as outwork and factory systems spread, more and more workers took jobs as wage earners. They labored under the control and direction of their employers, and unlike women who embraced factory work, men felt like it was restricting. So I know I'm repeating that, but I want to emphasize this. Women found factory work more liberating because they're getting to work outside the home and make their own money for the first time. But men felt like it was restricting. And so you see the first labor unions are led by men. In fact, the critics in the South who favored slavery over industrial workers called the industrial workers wage slaves. Now, labor unions were viewed as illegal because if you went on strike, it would shut down production. They viewed that as restraint of trade and therefore unconstitutional. So later in American history, labor unions are going to be legalized. So by 1820, half of industrial workers were children under the age of 10, which is gut-wrenching if you think about that. The average workday before 1800, about 12 hours. By 1820, that increased to about 14-hour days. Can you imagine going into work at 7 a.m. and not getting off till 9:30? Okay. And so it was terrible. Now, one of the things they did is they formed labor unions. And so they're pushing for not just now today we have an 8-hour workday typically, but they push for a 10-hour workday. And they organized originally in their trade. So if you were a textile mill worker, then you would organize a textile mill union. If you were later in the second phase industrial revolution, a steel worker, then you would have organized into a steel labor union. And so the National Trades Union was the first regional union of different trades. So that's the first, it's not completely national yet, like it wasn't in all states, but it grew to include multiple regions, which was revolutionary. And so workers, when they would try to go on strike, the factory owner almost always won. Later in American history, that's going to change. But so like, let's say if I, as an individual, am unhappy at work and I complain, I'd be like, well, my pay is terrible. These hours are ridiculous. These terrible work conditions. Well, the boss be like, all right, well, you don't like it, get riddance, you're fired. But if you had all 100 of your workers doing that, then the idea is that bargaining collectively, the factory owner would be more likely to listen to you. But because they typically had the government's backing at the state level and even local level, unions are not going to be successful because the factory owner had the backing of the state and local governments. Okay, so a lot of these wage earners had loyalty to the Democratic Party, and I covered that more in the Democratic Revolution PowerPoint. But like I said, there are always three things they're always pushing for. You can write this down in your notes: better pay, better hours, which means less hours, better working conditions. Now, there was a Supreme Court case, Commonwealth versus Hunt, that made it where labor unions were not necessarily illegal. Okay, as long as they were peaceful, labor unions could be legal. So that's where you start having labor unions legalized. Now, does it mean that they were embraced and loved? And no, not at all. Okay, and you can see right here the amount of factory workers in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. A little bit in Vermont. These are textile mills. More of them are going to move to the South after the Civil War. I covered that in the Reconstruction lecture. All right, so we're going to stop there, and we're going to come back to the market revolution and another part of the this topic.